For the next few chapters in the textbook, we're moving away from the foundational aspects of our political system, which included the ideas of democracy, the Constitution and the rules of the game, the supreme law of the land, and how that establishes what people in our political system do and don't do. Federalism, the idea of separating powers between the national government and the state governments, the division of those powers. Civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties because once the Bill of Rights was added to the U.S. Constitution as setting up one of the premier goals of our political system, which is to protect individual liberties. And then we talk about civil rights, where the 14th Amendment suggests that political equality is then added to the list of things that our political system would deal with. And we talked about the challenges of that actually occurring and the struggles of civil rights. So all of those are very institutional ideas. Now we're moving into what the textbook calls the linkage institutions. We're going to be talking about the media. We're going to be talking about interest groups. We're going to be talking about political parties. And those are ways in which we link these more foundational ideas to closer to the outcomes of the political system. We also talk about this in terms of linking us, we the people, to our elected representatives. And so it is not us just that actually influences what government officials do. And it isn't just government officials doing their job and ignoring us. Instead, they often use these same institutions, interest groups, political parties, as a way to have a discussion with us. And the chapters in this section will talk about what contribution each of these institutions make to our idea of democracy, popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality. They start with that, they end with that, and so it's definitely worth taking a look at the chapter to get that expression and that understanding of where that comes from. But what we want to talk about is the media, and if you notice, this is one long lecture. Sorry, I don't mean long, not the emphasis on the long, but the idea that this is one lecture rather than dividing it into smaller lectures as I do with some of the other chapters, and that's because this chapter is one that generally talks about this in terms of the overall effect of the media. That doesn't mean we can't identify certain aspects of it, certain influences that exist, but really the emphasis on this is talking about the role and that this is an interaction, and we need to take a look at that overall. And once we make that argument, once you read the textbook, I think you get that. You hear this lecture and go over the PowerPoint slides, I think you'll get that idea as well. And you don't want to lose the idea of the specificity of some of these things, for example, what the watchdog role is, or talking about the distinction between traditional media and online media, and things like that, or the role of bias. And so the section headings that are in the textbook, the bold-faced words that are in the textbook, are certainly worth knowing, but I think it's a lot easier once you understand what the overall interaction is, that you can then memorize those things or understand those things without even having to memorize them. So with that as an introduction to both this section of the course, but also of the media, I want to move on to the which is a pictorial of the media in American political life. There are lots of boxes, and there's a circle in the middle and things like that, and some arrows pointing around, and there should be more feedback loops if this were an official figure to understand exactly the complexities of this political system, of this larger system. But even this fairly simplistic drawing is one that gives us some important understanding of the role of the media in terms of its importance, in terms of what the main influences are on the media and what the influence of the media is on us. And so taking a look at the picture overall, you'll see one obvious thing, which is that the media stands in the middle. The media is the center point of this model. This model argues that the media plays a particularly important role in our political system. And as the textbook points out, as we're going to be talking about in this lecture, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's a strong reason to believe that the media is an important institution to understand how people attempt to influence the representatives, elected and unelected, as well as how they attempt to influence us. And the textbook points out some important information about those things. For example, most of the news stories, 70 to 90% of the news stories that appear in the traditional media come from are started by or influenced significantly by official proclamations by the government officials. They're interviews with government officials. They are press releases. They are reporters covering the actions of these government officials. And to a large extent, then, the government officials are using the media as a way to influence the messaging of what they're doing and why they're doing it. Doesn't mean the media can't ask tough questions, and there are ways in which the textbook points out there are reasons why they do or do not ask those tough questions, and you should take a look at that. But the idea is that there is certainly an important role for government officials recognizing the use of the media as a way to get out the information about what they're doing to we the people. They don't call us up directly. They don't necessarily just send us information about what they're doing. They do that. Government officials do that from time to time. Usually, close to an election time, they'll do it. But generally speaking, there's a lot of activity the government does, and it needs to be in contact with us and through the media. Similarly, if we want to express our displeasure, if we want to talk about the things we don't like about the government or the government actions and things like that, through the media that the public officials find out about that. We can go to their constituency office. We can call up a member of Congress. Sometimes that is done. Sometimes it's done in a coordinated way when we talk about interest groups. But generally speaking, it's done more through the media. It is the media that then reports on the actions of the interest groups that are protesting some decision by the government. It is a public opinion poll that the news agencies have put out to get a sense of what the people think about the situation in Iran, or what people think about in terms of ideas about whether interest rates should be higher or lower, whatever the question might be. They will produce stories, and the elected officials will read those and hear about those and be influenced to some extent by those. And so certainly this model is one that says the media is an important, as the phrase suggests, mediary between these important parts of a representative democracy. And so in that sense, the media plays a really important role. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that throughout this lecture, and the textbook certainly talks about that. The other thing that we see is if you take a look at the left side of the drawing, you take a look at the role of the corporate ownership of the media. That leads to ideas of business concerns and the profit motive, which then has a direct influence on what the media does. But then the idea of business concerns and the profit motive might have an influence in terms of the sort of bias that we see. And so in this sense, the media is not free to do whatever it wants. It isn't free to seek out the information that it needs to be able to hold government officials accountable. It is not the one that is just simply able to do whatever it wants. There are important constraints on what they do and what priorities the media have. And so we need to talk about that. The textbook certainly does it. We're going to echo that here because that influences what the media is able to do. And the final thing about this picture is talking about the idea of the arrows. The arrows are talking about how the public tries to influence the media and how the media tries to influence the people. And the way it's written or drawn in this model is that the arrows are the strength. And so that's not entirely accurate. I think you can take a look at it in terms of taking a look at the very bottom of the picture leading to the media. And so the role of we the people, our ideas of public opinion, our values and beliefs, our actions, our political behavior, all of those things can somehow influence the media or attempt to influence the media. And the most obvious one, and one that people often do when they hear about the corporate ownership of the media, how the media doesn't necessarily provide us with the information we need to be good democratic citizens, many times what people will argue is that we have a boycott. We could say we don't like the things that are being done by certain media outlets, and therefore we're going to go somewhere else. But part of this, and why this is an entire system we have to take a look at, the corporate ownership of the media, the business concerns and the profit motive, creates it so that there are very few outlets you can go to that aren't influenced by this corporate influence on the media. Most of the media, as we're going to be talking about more specifically a little bit later, most of the media in the United States is controlled by corporations. They're private institutions that have a profit motive as core to their values, core to their, as we saw in the Citizens United video, there was one that talked about the idea that corporations are almost legally required to maximize profit. And so even if there are organizations that own media outlets that want to do good, want to provide us with accurate information, there are still constraints because they are private institutions that are seeking profit, and profit then what sort of things they can do, what sort of priorities they're going to follow. And so in this sense, the influence from one part of the diagram to the other may not be equal, because we may not be able to go to seek out other sources of information as easily as we might find. There are good sources of information. There are places where people can get information about what is going on, but it's very difficult to do. And so we have to recognize that even if we would like to go somewhere else to be able to get good, unbiased information, or what we consider to be unbiased information, that's going to be a complicated thing we have to do, and have to recognize the limitations that we have on that. But we also know the influence on us, that the arrow drawn between the media and we the people should be huge, because it's not simply the idea that's certainly important, how we think about political issues, what sort of priority we place to different things, the agenda setting role that the textbook talks about in terms of what we think the government should be doing is influenced to a large extent by the media and the coverage of the news in the world around us. But it goes even deeper than that. There is a political socialization effect of the media. It has an influence on us in terms of what our values are, what our beliefs are. And if that's the case, there's a huge implication for the media to influence these things, and whether or not they're taking that seriously, whether or not their actions are ones that are putting on the sort of programming that we need to have, that's an open question, something we have to think about. So this is just an overview of the ways in which we're going to be attacking this, and let's move on to the next slide. We have the idea of the question of what should we include in this definition of the media, that circle that's in the center. And the textbook talks about an important distinction between traditional media and online media. And traditional media are those things along the lines of newspapers, and not just using newspapers to line the cages of your bird or something like that, but newspapers that people actually would get and sit down and read and look through the newspaper on a Sunday or during the week before they start their day. And obviously the antiquated nature of even suggesting that is pointing out the ways in which this traditional media is not being used nearly as much as it was in the past. When I was growing up, the traditional media were the things we talked about, and it was a big deal when textbooks like this would stress media and the role that it would play in political life. But when you talk about the idea of the traditional media, you include newspapers, TV, broadcasting, cable, radio, magazines, things like that. Things your parents or perhaps your grandparents used to access the information. If you take a look at figure 6.1 in your textbook, that older people, people who are 50 and older, tend to use this traditional media to a large extent. And of that, the one that seems to be the most important, still for the overall group, for everyone, is the idea of traditional media, particularly local TV news. That seems to be still the majority of information that people get about the political world around them comes from TV, particularly local TV news. But you also recognize when you hear that phrase that it doesn't make much sense to you, because many of you don't look at that at all unless you happen to be visiting your grandparents. But it is the case that they are consistent consumers of those, and therefore it overwhelms in terms of the aggregate data that we have. But certainly a much more shifting towards online media over traditional media. And so that's an important change. But for now, if asked a question, where is the source of most news for Americans, it's probably still going to be local TV news. It's going to be something that is fairly local. It's going to have an emphasis on local and particular sort of interests in ideas. It's going to be one that is in a fairly short format. It is one that is a 30-minute time period, but with commercials, at least about to 22 minutes news. A lot of it is going to be taken up by sports, particularly because the LA Dodgers are doing well, and some wonder about what the LA Lakers are going to do. So you have sports is going to take up some room, and then it limits significantly what sort of priorities are going to be added in. The linkage between stories that cuts down on the amount of availability for analysis of any political news. And then the other thing is that TV news is one that's going to be a visual one, and so therefore it's going to have an emphasis on these visuals as opposed to perhaps charts and figures and complex ideas. And so it has an influence in terms of the type of news and how people think about politics because of that. But traditional media is not the only way in which we're influenced. Online media plays an important role. So you have things like blogs, podcasts, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of those things certainly have an influence, particularly on people 18 to 49, but it's having a huge impact in terms of the behavior of politicians and the way in which they try to talk to us. And so online media is certainly playing an important role, and it's an increasingly important role. And so now it is just by a little bit you have that people tend to rely on traditional media as opposed to online media. In the next couple of updates for this textbook, it's going to switch and talk about how online has taken over traditional media. But one question about online media that we saw a little bit in terms of talking about online harassment. and some of the things that you even did in your discussion post pointed this out, were ideas about the role of these media companies in terms of policing the sort of content that's available there. And some of the concern not they would do a good job with it, and all of those things. And certainly people pointed out, and you're right to point that out, that there are ways in which there are limitations, because when you sign up to use that platform, you do say there is going to be community standards and things like that. And so there's a mechanism whereby they could turn around and change that and kick you off, or as someone talked about, demonetize. If you're trying to make money on this, one way they can grab your attention is to say, well, because this is so offensive, you're not allowed to make money on these videos anymore, etc. And so there certainly is a role. But at the same time, these media platforms like to argue that they are just platforms for discussion, and therefore should not be, and that this is the marketplace of ideas, and they're not responsible for the ideas that people put on these platforms. So instead, it should be seen as something that has very light levels of regulation. And you're starting to see online medias grapple with that, and they're trying to get the best of both worlds. And that is that they would like to be seen as a platform and therefore have very light regulation, but at the same time, they also are playing some role in terms of editorial is good content and what is not good content. And that is a difficult position to try to have both things, as we talked about, that there are often trade-offs, and trying to do both simultaneously is a difficult thing to do. And so the dynamics of online media and traditional media can often be discussed as very different, and your textbook does a nice job of that, so we're not going to talk a lot about that. But even if the dynamics might be different from those of online media and traditional media, who is using them, how they use that information, there are some important similarities. And one of those similarities is that both are driven by the profit motive. It is corporations that own both traditional media and online media. And so it is one in which, if the profit motive influences the activities of the media, as we argue it is, things may not be completely different online, and that doesn't create a role for democracy in ways that people often suggested would be the case. And so the other thing is the very last bullet point is the one we talked about a little bit earlier, is the idea that traditional media, especially TV, is still where the majority of Americans get their news. And just pointing you again to figure 6.1, which talks about the breakdown in terms of how people argue the source of their news and who is actually influencing them. So what we want to do next, and we're going to do lectures, is to move on and talk about the dynamics of that pictorial model a little bit.